Bert, that's a lovely photo there of you as a young man in television. How do you feel when you look back at that photograph?
I feel like an older man in television. That was pretty important to me, that shot, because it was my first fan card ever. I guess I was 15 or 16 at the time, before television. It was actually taken for radio. And it wouldn't mean very much to anybody else, except somebody who's found themselves in my position. I was the youngest announcer on a radio station. And everybody else, all the senior announcers, had their own fan card, and I didn't have one until that one was taken, and I thought then I'd really made it.
15 or 16 is terribly young. I mean, what happened to your teenage years, your childhood?
Jo, actually, I really didn't have any teenage years. I had a good childhood, but when I discovered radio when I was 11, all of a sudden it was the biggest romance of my life. It was the greatest discovery of my life, and there's a price to pay for everything. And as much as I love radio and then got to love television, I did have to make a sacrifice, and everything comes with a price, and the price I had to pay was no teenage years, no dances, no real first dates. I mean, I started taking girls out, I guess, when I was 17 or 18, but not in quite the same way as other guys did, because they really had to be girls who were in the industry, in radio or theatre. The station where I used to work, 3XY, was in the Princess Theatre building. And that was great fun because there were always, there was plenty of action around the place.
Do you have regrets about missing that important part of your life?
Not now, but when I hit the 20s, I realised I'd missed out on something. And at 21, 22 years of age, when I was doing television across the board, I looked quite mature, and I certainly sounded quite mature, but that wasn't the truth of the matter. I wasn't mature. I was basically someone who looked 21 years of age, but I was still a kid of 15 or 16, because you've got to have those things happen to you and for you. You've got to go through that teenage experience, and I don't even recall getting any acne.
Was the young Bert Newton a bit of a ham, a bit of a performer at school?
No, I was very quiet. I was very shy. I had my moments, but I don't think anyone who knew me back in those years would have suggested that I would go into show business. Although my late father, whom I didn't know all that well, I was being told just recently by my eldest brother that when he came back from the war, when my dad came back from the war, and saw me for the first time in 3 years, and I guess then I was, 4 or 5 years of age, he said to my mother and my eldest brother, "I don't know what that kid's going to be, but it's not going to be what we've been, carpenters, plumbers. There's something different about that boy." And I only hope that I'm around long enough to see what he becomes. As it happened, Dad died long before I got into show business, but I thought it was extraordinary that, I remember he took me to my very first radio show. There was a program called The Heckle Hour, which was basically an all-in brawl, a debating type radio show. Quite an extraordinary one, actually, and I was only a kid. And I think my dad had a great interest in radio and theatre and show business generally, and perhaps, I don't know, as early as that, he might have been trying to find out whether that was my bent. But as I say, he didn't live long enough. You've
suffered the ups and the downs. Now, what inner strength does Bert Newton draw from to cope with all that and survive for such a long time?
I don't think you ever get used to it, but I think you become a little stronger. I think you steel yourself against it more easily after a bit of experience of it. I mean, I was completely naive when things started to happen, and all of a sudden I'd drive past a news agency and I'd read, my latest love affair or Bert collapses or whatever. I think experience helps you a hell of a lot. My faith helps me a lot, and my family helps me a lot. And I've never really taken myself too seriously. I think that's pretty important. I take the job seriously, but not myself too seriously. And it's quite obvious that when you read a story about anybody who's in the public eye, If it's condemning, if it's highly critical, it really affects only one person, and that's the person about whom the story is written. Because as much as I admire good writing, newspapers do become fish wrappers pretty quickly.
They sound as though they were unpleasant experiences, but there must be some really painful memories.
You mean press-wise?
Press-wise, or in your career generally?
Well, I suppose it's always disappointing when you go for something and you think that you've managed to pull it off, and the press decides otherwise. But I've got to say, in fairness, Jo, that I went through a honeymoon period in the mid-70s to the mid-80s, or certainly the early 80s, in which seemingly I couldn't do a thing wrong. I had a very successful radio show. I had a very successful Talent Quest and New Faces, and the Don Lane show was the highest rating Tonight Show in history, and I had specials like the Logies and so forth, and it was a golden era for me. And along with that golden era, I got tremendous press coverage and critiques. Before that, the harsher comments I tried to accept, and if they did hurt me, keep that to myself. Since then, since that golden period went into to temporary hold, I've got my fair share of criticism, but I think it all levels up eventually if you accept the good, and if you enjoy reading nice things about you.
Is that the key to the success of, say, your relationship with Graham Kennedy? Was that a disciplined thing?
Well, I think in the case of Graham, we were friends before television began. I mean, he is singularly the most outstanding performer that Australian television has discovered. And I can say that without any extra beating of the heart or any feelings of jealousy or envy. There are other people who couldn't say it because of his success. He was a man that a lot of people felt very jealous of. They, once again, why him and why not me? That never concerned me, because I think he opened up so many things for so many of us in television. I mean, probably stupid things that are taken for granted now, but he was the first person to have his own dressing room. And when he was tired of that, I got it. He was the first person to have a trailer, a caravan as a dressing room, and when he tired of that, I got it. So I thought, well, I'm on a good wicket here. I'll just keep following whatever he doesn't want. It'll be my turn. And I think the reason for our success together as friends really was that he understood right from the start that there were going to be no knives from me, and also the sort of work that I did was sufficiently different to his that I would have no concerns about him.
Why then does the press spend so much time, or did it at that time spend so much time, comparing the two of you and saying, well, Graham's the king, why is Bert always the bridesmaid? When is he going to have his day?
Well, I think that may have been one of my good fortunes, that I was seen as the bridesmaid. And I think there was almost a sympathy vote for me. I didn't play on this, and I didn't take advantage of it. But I was having my day while people didn't even realise I was. I remember Florence Henderson, the lady from the Brady Bunch. She was over here for the Logies a couple of years ago, and I admit it was a time when I was doing a lot of work. And we worked on the Logies together. Then I saw her again on the Don Lane show the following Monday, so 3 or 4 days later. And she called me aside and she said, I've got to ask you something. She said, we worked together on the Logies. She said, Saturday night I turned my television on. She said, and you were hosting a special. She said, Sunday night I tuned on around about 6:30 and did a program called New Faces. And I said, yes. And she said, in my hotel this morning I turned the radio on and you were doing a morning program. And you're now working on the Don Lane show tonight. And I said, yes. What's the question? She said, well, I tuned on for the news this evening. Why weren't you reading it?
Is there anybody else on Australian television?
So perhaps, in that particular era, there was a lot of me around. That's why, if things aren't happening as much now as they used to, I've got no regrets, because I started out with no ambitions, and the only ambition I had was to be a radio announcer. In the early days, my profile was mainly about romance, alleged drinking problems, a nervous breakdown that I suffered some 25 or 26 years ago, and it seems to me hardly a day of my life goes by now without me having to recall that. For someone
In
who's
what
written
way?
me.
Well, because the press will keep referring
Oh
back
no,
to it?
people will write. It's an interesting thing, Joe. There's an interest that seems to flow and ebb on nervous breakdowns, and also shock treatment, which I had, and also LSD, a treatment that I had on LSD. And if I get a message to ring Harry Smith from a certain magazine, re 1963, I know to myself, it's the LSD or the shock treatment or the nervous breakdown thing they want to talk about. And I talk about it quite frankly, simply because I know that on past occasions, when I've been totally honest about what happened to me, I've been able to help some people who've written to me, and they're people that I know about. There may be other people who wouldn't bother to write or to make contact.
What did happen to you?
Everything just got too much. It was a situation where I was working very hard. I was also playing very hard. Maybe it went back to that thing we talked about before, that I really hadn't had a normal teenage life, and perhaps part of my persona was crying out, that where were the good times that the other people have had? And there was a huge pressure back in those years, being on television, or a pressure that I felt anyway, that I haven't felt since. And everything came to a head. I had what they call anxiety neurosis. And I don't say that flippantly, except that I think it sounds so much better than a nervous breakdown. And it took me about 6 months, 5 or 6 months, I guess, to come to terms with it and to be, in parenthesis, cured.
Do you think that experience taught you methods of coping that you've used throughout your career?
Yes, yeah, it did. It got my priorities right, because when I was lying there in a hospital, feeling completely wretched and not knowing what was going to happen and making irrational decisions. I mean, I resigned from the Nine Network 3 days after I had this breakdown, quite stupidly. I mean, apart from any other consideration, there was finance involved that was rightly mine, that I cut off supply. I got, when I left hospital a couple of months later, I immediately went back to the Nine Network, because they realised at the time that I wasn't, or as well as I should have been. But I learnt to get my priorities right, and also it gave me an understanding, but took me away from perhaps the glamorous side of television, which I'd quite enjoyed and realised still exists, but there are more important things.
I noticed that the photos you provide for an interview are generally all press photos. We don't see your children or much of your family. Is that a definite ploy on your part to keep part of your life very private?
Yeah, there are just a couple of things that I don't do. I never have any photographs, any publicity photographs taken at home. Cameras aren't welcome at home. I'll go anywhere for a press call if I think it's important. But I think you've got to have something remain sacrosanct. And with the kids, they have been photographed for magazines. I think, in actual fact, probably you and I think the same way along these lines. I mean, we don't hide our children completely from the press, but they're not in every publication every day of the week. Mainly for their sake. I wouldn't like them to hit 17 or 18 years of age or even younger and then say, we were simply just used as toys, as part of the ongoing publicity blurb that surrounds my dad.
It's very difficult for children, isn't it, when their parents are well known?
Yeah, well, it depends. In the case of my son, he gets a pretty hard time from certain quarters. In the case of my young daughter, she loves every minute of it. And I see this happen. I drive them to school, and in the case of my son, he prefers me to drop him about 100 yards down from the front gate, so he won't get a hard time. In the case of my daughter, she likes me to drive her right up to the front door so everyone can see us. Now, that may be, the difference there may be the 2 years that separate them, and perhaps in a couple of years' time, I hope not, but she might feel the same way as Matthew
Or the
does.
differences of the sexes. Would you want a career in television for either of your children?
Well, Matthew does a couple of acting bits, and he does commercials, and Lauren's done some modelling. I don't know. I doubt very much if either will go into show business, but if they do, it's very easy to have plans and attitudes now, and then find in a couple of years' time, of course, that they won't work. But I would help as much as I possibly could. There was a time last year, actually, when I was driving Matthew around to various commercials and acting jobs and so forth. I suddenly realised he'd done more work in a month than I had in 3 months. And I used to say to him, who'd you work with today? And he'd mentioned a couple of actors, and I said, did they ask about Dad? Or, how things going? He enjoys it. So long as he enjoys it, it's pocket money, and it's. I did the same thing when I was a kid.
You had a lot of support from your mother, didn't you? Now, this was about the same time that your father passed away, was it?
Yeah. Well, I was very, very close to my mother. I guess most people are close to their mother, but we had a very special bond. I lost my mum 9 years ago, and not a day goes by without me thinking of her and without me missing her terribly. I've never really come to terms with that. I remember when I was a youngster, it's funny how things stick in your mind. I could take you to the very spot where this happened. I guess I was 11 years of age, 12 years of age, and I was waiting for a bus to take me into a radio station where I was in a kids show. And for some reason my mind wandered to what it was going to be like when my mother died. And by the time I got on that bus, I was crying my eyes out. And the conductor of the bus said, what's wrong? Have you hurt yourself, or have you got a problem? And I forget what I told him. But I just got so emotional thinking about life without my mother. And then whip pan to many years later, when Mum died, I felt exactly as I did on that bus all those years ago, and it was a very difficult time for me. I remember sometimes people, because I lived at home until I got married, lived at home with Mum and my brother and sister, they used to say, God, your mother's apron strings and Mummy's boy and so forth, and obviously not meant to hurt, but meant to just have a gentle jibe at me. But it was always the greatest compliment that they could pay me, because you have only, I know it's the oldest cliche in the world, but you have only one mother, one natural mother. And if it just happens that she in your eyes is the greatest person that has ever lived, what a wonderful experience. I mean, she taught me so much. She was the most loyal person I've ever come across in my life. She lived for her family. She was a proud Australian. She was God-fearing and God-loving. All the things that people, I believe, should aspire to. And there it was given to me in a package.
It was a difficult period of growing up for you, a difficult developmental period, because not only did you lose your father, you also lost your sister, who was very dear to you.
Yes, I mean, it's life, and there's not much you can do about it. I was very close to my sister too. She died. She predeceased Mum by a couple of years, and we were very close. She had a hard life in some respects. She at a young age, 19 years of age, she got tuberculosis at a time when tuberculosis was a killer in some cases. She survived, fortunately, but then she got cancer later in her life, and she died in 1975. And that was another blow too. I believe in God, and I have a strong faith, but I still wonder why. She was such a terrific person. She was a wonderful woman. She was very feminine. She liked people. She did all the right things in her life. And all I'm saying basically is, why was she chosen? Number one, to get tuberculosis and have her young teenage years, where I think she was engaged at the time, and the engagement was broken.
We have a photograph here of your sister,
that's
who you
my
lost,
dad
and your father.
They were very close and very similar as people, I believe. I mean, I'm judging only on what I've been told about my dad.
Did that really rock your faith?
Well, I thought then it could do one of two things. It could rock it, or it could strengthen it. And at that stage of the game, I'd gone through what used to be called, I'd gone through a period of being a lapsed Catholic. I wasn't, going to Mass regularly, and I wasn't taking the sacraments. And when my sister died in 1975, as I say, I had the choice to do one of two things: to say, well, there can't be a God to do that to such a wonderful person and have her suffer as much as she did, and she did suffer a lot. Or say, well, it was done for a reason, and there's a greater plan that I haven't seen as yet. So, in actual fact, my sister's death brought me back to the Catholic Church, from whence I haven't strayed since '75, and I feel very very close to her as the result of that.
Now, another extremely important relationship in your life is, of course, your relationship with your delightful wife, Patty. What is the secret to that relationship? What makes them work?
We've known each other for most of our lives. In the radio children's program that I used to co-compare and be the announcer and so forth, Patty was a young singer, much younger than I, singer on the show. So we've been lifelong friends, and when we became lovers, it just seemed a natural progression. And when we married 15 years ago, Patty came into a marriage knowing exactly what it was like to be married to someone who was in show business, because she indeed had spent most of her life in the industry, and she understood the pressures. She can bring me down to earth very quickly. And it's not a perfect relationship. No relationship is. And we've found it a couple of times. We've never separated, but there have been some very rugged periods. That's the one thing that I always try and dodge in doing any press, and that is the ideal marriage syndrome, because it's always embarrassing to do that sort of story, particularly on a day when you've just had the most unholy argument. You don't just have arguments; we have world wars when they actually occur. And I hate to see our marriage painted as being perfect. It's right for us, but you've got to keep working at it.
Well, there is the expectation that you're both larger than life and everything is all roses, and I guess particularly in this sort of industry, the stresses and strains are great, and the efforts to undermine you.
Yeah, I don't think it would have worked for me if I'd married somebody outside the industry. I guess it depends with whom you fall in love, but I think looking back, I don't think I've taken too many girls out who weren't in show business or associated with show business in some way. In the old days, mainly because of the hours that we worked, but now, of course, I realise that there were other considerations too, and that is to understand. And also, when Patty's working, if she's doing a spot somewhere, I understand the pressures that she's going under. She's not the best study in the world, a study of lines. Once she gets them, she's right, but I'm a pretty fast study, and I'm a little impatient when she's concerning herself about a job that's coming up in 3 weeks' time. I'd rather worry the night before, but she doesn't work that way. And we're very different in that respect as performers.
But complementary, obviously.
Well, yes. And she's very much a perfectionist, probably more so than I am. And she likes to have every I dotted and every T crossed. We did a show just recently, and she wanted to know, as I say, 2 or 3 weeks before exactly what we were going to do. And I said, well, I don't know until we get there.
Well, at only 52, what comes next? What do you still have to achieve in your life?
53, hopefully. I don't know. I'm a great believer in fate, and I believe that there's always something waiting for you. I'd like to think there's another television show which would perhaps suit my talents as a bloke who's now 52. Obviously there are some things that I did years ago which I wouldn't be suitable for now.
Would a part of you die if there was no more television for Bert Newton?
Jo, sometimes I worry that stories could be written that look as if I believe that the industry owes me a living. It doesn't. It owes me nothing. It owes nothing to anybody. It's an industry just like anything else, and if you're right for the job, you should get it. My belief has always been, regardless of whether you're 18 or 80, male or female, which is not very important now, but it was in days gone by, that when women were finding it very hard to get any sort of role in radio and television. I think if you're the right person, you should get the job. So if there's something there for me in the future, fine. If not, it's not the end of the world, because I've been very lucky. I've worked very hard for my breaks, but no, I've got no regrets. If it all finished today, no regrets. I'd pine for having one more shot simply because I enjoy it so much. If it was an industry I didn't enjoy, I'd say, well, terrific. It's time to get out. And I always believed that I would get out at my choosing. But the ground rules. I mean, nobody in television resigns. I can't think of one person.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us, Bert. I'm sure that the future of the Australian television industry will benefit from experience such as yours. It was great getting to know you better. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jo. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.